I'm not sure how to feel about this one. On one hand, it was a story about mourning from many different perspectives, which was great. And on the other hand, it was the most convoluted, unusual telling of a simple story I've ever seen. I had to sit and think about it for a while before I even wrote this review. Welcome back to It's Too Late to Apologize Book Reviews. I'm Stella, and today we're going to be talking about As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner. As I Lay Dying is a Southern Gothic novel published in 1930 and is narrated by 15 different characters over 59 chapters. Yeah, 15 different characters. This story is about the Bundren family, who are each dealing with the impending death of their matriarch, Addie Bundren, in very different ways. Addie lies in bed, and outside her window, she watches her eldest son, Cash, as he builds her a coffin as she's requested, and it's her dying wish to be buried with her people in Jefferson. This is an unusual request, as many of the characters attest. That means her family will have to transport her body to the town of Jefferson, which is quite a ways away. Addie dies, and through heat and flood and famine and misery, the Bundrens embark upon an obstinate pilgrimage that takes 9 days to bury this woman who meant something completely different to each of these characters. Immediately within the first few chapters, we feel this tension and deep buried hate these family members have for one another. And at first the reader doesn't really understand where this hate originates from. But as the story goes on, we get more and more of the puzzle pieces, and we see things more clearly. The Bundren family members are Addie, the dying matriarch, who we discover is actually quite a cruel woman who believes words are useless and only actions or imposing violence on others is the way to make her presence felt. We have Anse, who is a lazy, selfish hypocrite who doesn't even feel the loss of his wife or the shame of taking money from his children or continuous charity from everyone around him. He claims, after suffering a bit of heat stroke early in life, that if he sweats, he will die. So everyone around him has to pick up his slack, and he doesn't care. Then there's Cash, who's the oldest son, a carpenter who builds Addie's coffin, and is aptly named as he is the only one in the family with a trade that brings in money. He's a man of few words, and believes in the completion of one action at a time. He's about 29 years old, and Addie's belief of words being useless definitely rubs off on Cash. Then there's Darl, the second oldest son. He's about 28 years old and is the character most given to introspection and deep thought, which makes people think he's odd. But he is the key to understanding this novel in general. It's through his eyes that we get a better perspective of the other characters because he is intelligent and self-aware enough to see into other people's motives and reasoning. And all the other characters tend to see is just themselves. Then there's the middle child, Jewel. He's about 18 years old and wild. He owns a horse, which is basically his spirit animal, but it is also the embodiment of his love and hate for his mother. Then there's Dewey Dell, a 16-year-old daughter who doesn't really think that deeply about anything and doesn't take responsibility for her situation or her mother's funeral and is at odds with Darl because he knows her secret. And last but not least, we have Vardaman. We don't know his age for sure. Some people think that he's younger, around the ages of between 8 and 10, and some think he's older, between 13 or 14, but we're not really sure. It could go either way, depending on how you read it. And Vardaman is having a really difficult time understanding his mother's death and death in general. And none of his other family members, other than Darl, really understand what he's going through. This is not a family defined by love, as we would like to idealistically think. It's in this story, as it is in real life, so much more complicated than that. This is an impoverished family, living on a farm. I'm not even sure I'm going to say this right. Yokanatapua, in Yotnapatafa County, Mississippi. A fictional place where many of Faulkner's works are set. And it's a Chickasaw word meaning water runs slow through flat land. That's deep. Real deep. And Faulkner wrote this story just as the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. This novel is about grief and complex family relationships, but it's also about what it means to be alive and what it means to die. Vardaman and Darl especially are grappling with the idea of what it means to die. Where do we go? What happens to our body? Are we our body, or do we become something else? The way that Faulkner uses language is fascinating in this novel. The novel's written in dialect, and every character's voice and use of dialect is different. There is a sense that there is what the character is saying and the underlying meaning and secret behind what they actually mean. And the stream of consciousness that is used in each character's perspective shows the tension between the lush inner worlds of these characters and how it's never really shared with anyone else. How what happens inside is completely hidden to anyone on the outside. Communications between characters are terse and curt and bereft of any intimacy. And this novel is incredibly cynical. There is no love in Addie and Anse's marriage. And even the act of childbirth is more about debts being paid than it is about love, which is really interesting considering Anse's hypocrisy of not being beholden to any man. And one can see this extend to Dewey Dell's situation also. And this cynicism even encompasses the act of heroism done by Cash, Jewel, and Darl. Cash's forging of the river and stoicism in the face of his injuries afterward seem ridiculous when one realizes, as the journey is not even about burying Addie, as it is also about getting Anse some new teeth in Jefferson. And Jewel earns his horse through a long bout over months of late-night labor in a neighbor's field, working the field, which was a heroic thing that he did to earn himself his horse that he loves. And he also saved the animals from the burning barn, but both endeavors seem to be for nothing. And Darl's burning of the barn was the most noble act, but one that ends in ruin for him. It seems that Faulkner is saying that the most craven route, Anse's route, ends up being the most gainful. And here I thought I was a cynical person. Nope. Match point to Faulkner on that one. So Faulkner is well known for being difficult to read. And a big part of this, I found, was how he plays with time and perspective. There are italicized sections that denote the character reflecting back on events from some later date, right in the middle of the events happening. This can be especially confusing with Darl because it seems as if he's present for his mother's passing, but he wasn't actually present for it, but he understands what's happening from afar. And Faulkner also loves to use long sentences, but that's not necessarily an issue in this novel like it is with his record-making 1,200-some word long sentence in Absalom, Absalom. I could grapple with all of those things, but what I struggled with at the beginning of this story is that I had no idea who these characters were. And every chapter being from a different perspective, and the chapters being really short, I struggled to understand who was who and what their relationship to one another was. And often when we're in one character's perspective, not all of the characters in the scene are named. And it becomes really confusing because I didn't really understand the framework or setup, and so it felt really nebulous and vague. Felt like it bounced around so quickly that I never felt like I had my bearings before we were in another character's perspective. So I made a list of the narrators and who they were and how they related to one another, and then started over reading the novel again. And it was so much better. I'll leave a copy or a version of this spoiler-free list in the description box if anyone wants to copy, paste, and print it out and use it for a bookmark, which is what I did. It completely changed the game for me when reading this novel, so it may help you also. But for me, the whole story, this terrible pilgrimage that they embarked upon, really came down to one defining question. Why on earth did Addie want to get buried in Jefferson? Why? She didn't have any other living family members, which made it weird. And especially weird considering her father, who she didn't even care about, was long dead. And she felt completely alone in life. So if you don't want any spoilers to As I Lay Dying, you should probably check out now, because we're about to get into it. In Addie's only chapter that she narrates, which, true to Faulkner's style, occurs after she dies, Addie says, and I quote, "In the afternoon, when school was out, and the last one had left with his little dirty, snuffling nose, instead of going home, I would go down the hill to the spring where I could be quiet and hate them. It would be quiet there, then, with the water bubbling up and away, and the sun slanting quiet in the trees, and the quiet smelling of the damp and rotting leaves and new earth, especially in the springtime, for it was worse then. I could just remember how my father used to say that the reason for living was to get ready to stay dead a long time. And when I would have to look at them day after day, each with his and her secret and selfish thought, and blood strange to each other blood, and strange to mine, and think that this seemed to be the only way I could get ready to stay dead. I would hate my father for having ever planted me. I would look forward to the times when they faulted, so I could whip them. When the switch fell, I could feel it upon my flesh. When it welted and ridged, it was my blood that ran. And I would think with each blow of the switch, now you are aware of me. Now I am something in your secret and selfish life, who have marked your blood with my own forever and ever. And based on that, I think this request to be buried in Jefferson was her last revenge on Anse, because she hated life. She hated her father for planting her. Her last wish was like the beating she gave to those children in her schoolhouse. Now you are aware of me. Now I am something in your secret and selfish life, who have marked your blood with my own forever and ever. Addie believes words are useless, and only actions or imposing violence on others is the way to make her presence felt, and she wants her presence felt. In her perspective, the way that she could make her presence felt was by requesting this one last burden upon her family, but I think especially Anse. And I find the only solace in this novel was that Addie didn't get her wish, because Anse didn't feel her presence. He was more concerned about getting some new teeth and then finding another wife, who quickly steps into name and position of the one who just vacated the spot. And it's so interesting that this woman, who is this sort of shadow cast over the entire novel, and the act of her last wish brings ruin and despair to almost everyone in her family, is so interesting because her family also see how quickly she was replaced, how quickly all of us might be replaced, and who will mourn anyone, especially seeing as how easily Darl is discarded, and now their mother's position is filled. Interesting. So him finding a new wife at the end really played with the perspective of identity and how replaceable everything was to Anse. Dewey Dell was solely concerned with getting an abortion to rid herself of her unwanted burden, which shows how much Addie's perspective has affected her, because Addie only had Dewey Dell and Vardaman to compensate Anse for the affair that she had that resulted in Jules' birth. And Cash, through most of this novel, is in so much pain and trying to survive that pain. And Vardaman didn't really understand what was going on and wanted to see the train in the store at the window in Jefferson. So the only two characters that really felt Addie's presence was Jewel and Darl, and were perhaps the only two she didn't want to have suffer, but in the end suffer the most. And Darl, poor Darl. He sets the fire at the barn that they spend the night at along their journey, because he was the only one who understood how ridiculous this pilgrimage was. He tried to end the madness and give his mother some sort of dignity, rather than being carted around for several days in the heat, rotting and chased by vultures, the smell of her carcass, disgusting people as they pass. But the coffin is saved from the fire, and the Bundrens avoid getting sued for the fire by claiming that Darl is crazy and committing him to an asylum. Darl, the sanest one among them. Darl doesn't go crazy. You can see it because his narrative and perspective doesn't degrade as it goes through. He, toward the end, is consumed by the laughter, but I believe it's because he's laughing at the ridiculousness of their situation, not because he's gone crazy. Darl is the sanest one among them. And how he didn't go crazy amongst his family members is amazing in itself. And now I wonder how the family will get by now that Darl, the only one who actually understood them all, is gone. I mean, I realize it's fiction, but I still wonder these things, okay? And Dewey Dell is happy that Darl is gone, so he won't tell her father her secret, as if her father would actually care much. And never mind that she won't be able to keep the secret for much longer anyways. But Cash is the only one who admits and understands that Darl isn't crazy. So Jewel thinks that they need to catch Darl and tie him up so that he doesn't set fire to something else before they have him committed to the asylum. And Cash thinks and says, "There ain't no use in that," I said. "We can wait till she is underground. A fellow that's going to spend the rest of his life locked up, he ought to be let to have what pleasure he can have before he goes. I reckon he ought to be there," Pa says. God knows it's a trial on me. Seems like it ain't no end to bad luck when once it starts. Sometimes I ain't so sure who's got e'er a right to say when a man is crazy and when he ain't. Sometimes I think it ain't none of us pure crazy and ain't none of us pure sane until the balance of us talks him that away. It's like it ain't so much what a fellow does, but it's the way the majority of folks is looking at him when he does it. Because Jewel is too hard on him. Of course it was Jewel's horse was traded to get her that night to town. And in a sense, it was the value of that horse Darl tried to burn up. But I thought more than once before we crossed that river and after how it would be God's blessing if he did take her out in our hands and get shut of her in some clean way. And it seemed to me that when Jewel worked so to get her out in the river, he was going against God in a way. And then, when Darl seen that it looked like one of us would have to go to do something, I can almost believe he done it right in a way. But I don't reckon nothing excuses setting fire to a man's barn and endangering his stock and destroying his property. That's how I reckon a man is crazy. That's how he can't see eye to eye with other folks. And I reckon there ain't nothing else to do with him but what the most folks say is right. But it's a shame, in a way. Folks seem to get away from the old and right teachings to say that says to drive the nails down and trim the edges well a ways, like it was for your own use and comfort you were making it. It's like some folks has the smooth, pretty boards to build a courthouse with, and others don't have no more than rough lumber fitting to build a chicken coop. But it's better to build a tight chicken coop than a shoddy courthouse. And when they both build shoddily or build well, neither because it's one or t'other is going to make a man feel the better nor the worse. And that's such an interesting point. Cash, who isn't one to deep thinking or many words, has this thought. It's so interesting because of all the things that they encounter when they try to transport Addie's body to Jefferson, it's almost as if, as he said there, that God was trying to take Addie off their hands. Every time they fought against those actions. So when it rained really hard and all the bridges were washed out, probably they should have said, maybe we'll just bury her in our own land and be done with it. But they didn't. They pushed forward and they crossed the river. They lost their horses, almost lost all of Cash's tools, almost lost the coffin. Perhaps they should have just let Addie been swept away in the current, but they didn't. They kept going. And they didn't have enough food. They didn't have shelter. Cash's leg was rebroken. Ended up being just this terrible, increasing horror show. And then Darl seeked a way to end it by setting the barn on fire, and then Jewel saves the coffin from the fire. It was yet another intervention that could have taken Addie off their hands, and they didn't take it. It's really interesting. So all that being said, I can't say that I enjoyed As I Lay Dying. I liked it better than Faust, but there was just something about the whole thing that didn't really speak to me. And I don't know why necessarily, because there was so much there to unpack. But what I really appreciated is how unique Faulkner's style and method is. I mean, remember, there are no new stories. Humanity is just regurgitating the same stories over and over and over again with slightly different details. There is nothing new. And I know a lot of people think Faulkner is pretentious or even obtuse. But what I really respect is the completely unique way he went about telling this story. I have never read anything else quite like this. And it makes me want to read more Faulkner to see if I can find one of his stories that I do connect with. I have Absalom and The Sound and the Fury on my shelf ready to go, and I'm really interested to see if I connect better with those. But have you read As I Lay Dying? What did you think? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Did you find it hard to understand? Leave me a comment down below. Please like and subscribe so more people can join our conversation and find some great books. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye. I'm not even sure I'm going to say this right. Yokanatapua, 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 Yokanatapua.